What happened when kamikaze pilots failed? They strapped themselves into cockpits loaded with explosives, said goodbye to their families, and prepared to die for the emperor. But here's what history books rarely tell you. Not all kamikaze pilots completed their missions. And for those who returned alive, whether by mechanical failure, weather, or human hesitation, a nightmare far worse than death often awaited them. The myth we've been sold. When we think of kamikaze pilots, we imagine young men consumed by fanatical devotion, racing toward American warships with unwavering resolve. It's a narrative of absolute commitment, of warriors choosing death over dishonor. But this sanitized version conceals a disturbing truth that the Japanese military desperately tried to hide. Many pilots failed their suicide missions, and the consequences were often more terrifying than the mission itself. Between 1944 and 1945, Japan launched approximately 3,800 kamikaze attacks. Yet here's the statistic that changes everything. Military historians estimate that only about 14 to 19% of kamikaze missions successfully hit their targets. So what happened to the others? Where are their stories? The answer reveals one of World War II's darkest psychological operations, the flight that wouldn't end. Picture this. You're a 19-year-old Japanese pilot. You've written farewell letters to your mother, drunk ceremonial sake with your commanding officers, and accepted the white headband bearing the rising sun. Your plane, often a barely functional aircraft deemed too old for conventional combat, is loaded with a 250-kilogram bomb. There's just enough fuel for a one-way trip. But 30 minutes into your flight, your engine starts coughing. Black smoke trails behind you. The target is still miles away, and you're losing altitude over open ocean. Do you crash into the water and die for nothing? Or do you turn back? This wasn't a hypothetical scenario. It happened hundreds of times. Engine failures plagued the kamikaze program because Japan was sending up planes that were already falling apart. American fighters intercepted many missions before they reached the fleet. Severe weather made navigation impossible. And sometimes, though rarely discussed in official records, pilots simply couldn't go through with it. The return, a fate worse than death. When a pilot returned to base, he entered what can only be described as psychological purgatory. The military's response depended on the reason for return, but the underlying message was always the same. You have failed in the ultimate duty. For mechanical failures, the reception was coldest. Officers would interrogate the pilot, scrutinizing every detail of the malfunction. Was the engine truly broken, or was this cowardice disguised as technical failure? Survivor accounts describe being isolated from other pilots who looked upon returnees with a mixture of pity and suspicion. You were now a living ghost, someone who was supposed to be dead, whose funeral had already been held, whose name had been memorialized. But here's where it gets darker. They would simply send you back up. Lieutenant Kenichiro Unuki returned to base 3 times due to mechanical issues. Each time, the psychological pressure intensified. Fellow pilots avoided him. His commanding officers barely spoke to him. On his 4th mission, his plane functioned perfectly. He never returned. Whether this was coincidence or the military ensuring reliable equipment for persistent survivors, we'll never know. The psychological torture chamber. The kamikaze program wasn't just about military tactics. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Young men were subjected to intense indoctrination that framed their deaths as the highest honor. They were told their sacrifice would save Japan, protect their families, and earn them eternal glory at Yasukuni Shrine. But this carefully constructed psychological framework completely collapsed when a pilot survived a mission. The entire edifice of meaning crumbled. You were supposed to die gloriously. Instead, you were alive, disgraced, and facing an uncertain fate that the propaganda had never prepared you for. Some pilots who returned multiple times reported being beaten by officers or subjected to brutal re-education sessions. Others described a more insidious torture, being forced to sit through repeated kamikaze send-off ceremonies, watching other pilots depart on missions while they remained behind, marked by failure. Survivor Hichiro Nemura later recalled, "I felt I had no right to be alive. Every morning I woke up was a betrayal of my comrades who had died. The officers didn't need to punish me. I was already living in hell. The reluctant warriors. Here's what makes this story even more complex. Not every kamikaze pilot was a willing volunteer. Despite decades of propaganda suggesting these were all zealous warriors eager to die for Emperor Hirohito, the reality was far messier. As Japan's situation grew desperate in late 1944 and 1945, the military increasingly relied on volunteer pilots whose choice was anything but voluntary. Pilots would be assembled and asked to step forward to volunteer. The social and military pressure made refusing nearly impossible. Those who hesitated were branded as cowards, and their families back home would face severe social consequences. Some pilots deliberately failed their missions, a fact that's almost impossible to prove from historical records, but emerges in private testimonies collected decades later. They might claim navigation errors or equipment malfunctions while actually avoiding their targets. This was extraordinarily dangerous because if their deception was discovered, the consequences could be severe. One American intelligence report from 1945 noted something peculiar. Several kamikaze planes that should have had clear approaches to American ships instead crashed into the ocean nearby or veered away at the last moment. Were these mechanical failures, or were they acts of quiet resistance from young men who didn't want to die? The lucky few who survived the war. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, there were kamikaze pilots who had failed missions and were still alive. For these men, the end of the war brought a unique form of trauma. They had been prepared to die, had failed to die, and now had to figure out how to live. Post-war interviews with these survivors reveal crushing guilt. Yukio Araki, who returned from 2 missions due to mechanical failures before the war ended, said in a 1990 interview, "For decades I felt I should have died. I couldn't enjoy anything, not food, not family gatherings, nothing. How could I, when so many of my friends are at the bottom of the ocean?" The Japanese government offered no special support for these men. Unlike conventional war veterans who could frame their survival within a narrative of service and duty, kamikaze survivors existed in a strange liminal space. Neither heroes nor victims, just living reminders of a failed military strategy and a national trauma everyone wanted to forget. The hidden history. Why don't we hear these stories more often? Because they complicate the narrative that both sides wanted to maintain. For wartime America, kamikaze pilots were fanatical enemies whose unwavering commitment justified the use of overwhelming force. For post-war Japan, the kamikaze mythology became simultaneously a symbol of ultimate sacrifice and a shameful reminder of militaristic excess. The pilots who failed and survived their missions disrupted both narratives. They proved that the kamikaze weren't unstoppable zealots but often terrified young men in deteriorating planes. They revealed the brutal coercion behind Japan's voluntary suicide missions. And they demonstrated that the line between heroism and cowardice, between success and failure, is far more complicated than wartime propaganda suggests. The legacy. Today, when we discuss kamikaze pilots, we owe it to history to tell the complete story, not just of those who died, but of those who were supposed to die and didn't. These men lived with survivors' guilt, military disgrace, and the psychological aftermath of a program designed to weaponize human life itself. The next time you see a documentary about kamikaze attacks showing planes diving into ships, remember, for every plane in that footage, there were 5 or 6 that never made it to their target. And behind each failed mission was a young man facing a terrible question that no warrior should ever have to answer. Is it worse to die as planned or to live as a failure? Their stories remind us that even in history's most extreme circumstances, human beings remain complicated, fallible, and heartbreakingly real. The kamikaze program wasn't just about Japanese military tactics or American naval defense. It was about what happens when nations ask the impossible of their youngest citizens, and what happens to those who somehow survive the unsurvivable.